Conservative critics of the media say the press is too liberal and point to studies which claim reporters themselves are overwhelmingly liberal. What do you think of such criticism?
Well, the studies are largely falsified, but there's some, in fact, if you take a look at, for example, there was a recent study of people invited on as experts on television, and they're overwhelmingly weighted over to the right. I mean, the American Enterprise Institute and so on. But nevertheless, so I think and if you look at the actual studies, the Licker and Rothman study, which is the main one, it's very seriously flawed. But I don't really think that's all too important because I basically agree with it. I mean, all of the studies are very bad. The fact of the matter is that by and large the media do represent sort of liberalism, like I suppose most journalists vote Democratic. So that I agree with. But I think that completely misunderstands the function of liberalism in a system of necessary illusions. In fact, if you look at my work, I mostly criticize the liberals, even the left liberals. I don't waste much time discussing George Will. That's a joke. But what's interesting to me is people like Anthony Lewis and Tom Wicker and the whole liberal establishment, the liberal journal, like what's called the liberal establishment, the Times, the Post, and so on. And I agree that they do generally represent liberalism. Their liberalism is, let's take the Vietnam War again. There were hawks who said, if we try harder, we'll win. And then there were doves, the liberals, who said, well, it's costing us too much and probably it's not going to work, so let's not win. Now, personally, I much prefer the hawks, at least they're honest. The doves are just totally dishonest. They basically agree with the hawks. They just say we're not going to get away with it. In fact, some of them said it explicitly, like, say, Arthur Schlesinger, who's a leading liberal historian and spokesman. His view was, well, I hope the hawks are right, but I don't think they are. And if they are right and we can win, even though we'll leave ruin and destruction, he says we'll all be praising the wisdom of the American government. It's just that it doesn't look like it's going to work. So what's the function of liberal? And that's quite typical, incidentally. Same on Panama. The liberals are ones who say, well, maybe it's imprudent. It's going to lose it's going to harm our relations with Latin America. It's going to interfere with drugs and so on. That's not what they're saying in Latin America. What they're saying in Latin America is this is, I guess just looking at the Honduran press, which is an ally, they're saying this is international totalitarianism. They're saying it's the Colossus of the North is on the rampage again, and it's totally lawless and violent. Nobody can survive in its path. That's not what the liberals are saying here. They're saying maybe it's going to be too costly and so on. That's quite typical. And what that means is that the role of liberalism is to set bounds on discussion. There's supposed to be a spectrum of discussion. That's very crucial if you want to establish illusions. You've got to make it look as if there's a debate going on. But you have to ensure that that debate is within very specific bounds. And the bounds of the debate, the assumptions of the debate, that's the propaganda system. Now, unless you accept those assumptions, you're not even part of the discussion. The assumptions are the United States has the right to do anything it feels like. We stand for right and good is defined as what we do, except we're allowed to make mistakes sometimes because nobody's perfect. We are free and democratic. Whatever we have is basically perfect, aside from some mistakes which we can fix up. That's the bounds of the debate. If you accept that, you're part of the debate. And then you can be either a conservative who says, let's be more brutal and harsh, or a liberal who says, well, maybe it'll cost us too much unless we're a little softer. But you have to accept the assumptions. So during the Indochina War, say, the doves, as I said, they were the liberals. They said, well, maybe it won't work. If you're talking about domestic affairs, the doves will say, let's take, say, the corporate media. The topic of this discussion. There's a range of opinion within the mainstream. There are some people who are worried that the media are getting too concentrated. Only a couple of corporations are running the whole thing, and there ought to be like 15 corporations running the whole thing. Those are the liberals. The fact is, if there were 15 corporations running the whole thing, it would be scarcely different, maybe slightly more diverse, but the basic problem wouldn't be touched. The fact that there's such a narrow concentration of resources in the society itself that there's just no way for the media to reflect anything but that concentration of power. As long as you got that concentration of capacity to decide what's invested and what's produced and so on, everything's going to affect it. If you try to make that statement, you're off the spectrum, even though it's trivial truth. So I agree that the media are largely liberal, and I think that's part of the success of the system of indoctrination. I mean, if you can take the position, see if you can criticize the media as being too far to the left, that's terrific, because that means their subservience to power is already regarded as too much of a deviation. That's a fantastic propaganda device. In fact, if dictators had any brains, that's exactly what they would do. They would. In fact, it's interesting that they do it. For example, if you take a look at the Russian press during the invasion of Afghanistan, the party chiefs and the military were condemning the Russian press on exactly the grounds that the so-called conservatives here were criticizing the American press during the Vietnam War. They were criticizing the Russian press because it was telling all these stories about, you know, the tragedy of the helicopter pilots who were getting shot at, and, you know, the soldiers on the ground, everywhere you look, somebody's killing them, and the thing isn't working, you know, and it's, all the mothers are in tears, and, you know, they were giving all this story which was just giving the wrong picture. It wasn't upbeat and optimistic. So that's the way, which is essentially the conservative line here, with about as much merit. Now, the American system is much more sophisticated. So the press really is dissident in this sense of accepting all the assumptions but saying they're not working. And that's marvelous, because that it makes it almost impossible to think anything except the assumptions. I mean, if you think, look, we're attacking South Vietnam, then your only attitude must be, I must be crazy, because even the liberals aren't saying that, you know, and who could be farther out than those guys? I mean, if even Anthony Lewis and Tom Wicker are saying we're defending South Vietnam, well, you know, it's got to be true, because those guys are far out leftists who are trying to attack the government. So that's a magnificent technique of control. In fact, I think so to come back, I agree with the conservative critique of the media, and I think that's the strength of the indoctrination system, precisely.